interesting topic on the table, and also very controversial. As I said, I call it a soft issue in the engineering environment, and sometimes one tends to overlook the soft issues to the detriment that it costs you at the end of the day. So today we have Andries Keun. Andries Keun. Keun, is it the right pronunciation? Andries?
That is absolutely perfect. Thank you, Danie.
All right, 100%. All right. The presentation will provide you with an easy to use behavioral profile framework to create self-awareness and adapt your behavior when managing others. Now, it's very important to notice that there's a difference between personality and behavior. Personality is something that is fixed in you at the early stage in your life. Behavior is a choice. You will behave in certain circumstances different ways. So Thomas International is a leading assessment provider operating in more than 60 countries around the globe. Their aim is to enable organizations to recruit, retain, and develop their employees through a range of assessments, related instruments, and services, thus focusing behavior, emotional intelligence, team development, and employee engagement, etc. They currently provide these services to a number of universities and other educational institutions in South Africa and around the globe. Andries is currently the Managing Director of Thomas International in Africa. His experience includes substantial time work in South Africa, the rest of Africa, Australasia, and the UK. Andries is a regular speaker at international conferences and events on the topics such as leadership, people management, and human behavior. Now, during this presentation, the protocol that we will follow on questions, we will use the Q&A column for questions aimed at Andries for clarification after the presentation. Andries will use the chat box during the presentation as and when he wants quick responses from you guys. So remember to use the two boxes differently. It's Q&A for questions to be answered after the presentation, and chat box. Andries will call on you guys to reflect some answers in the chat box during the presentation. Andries, thank you very much for your assistance in sharing your valued knowledge on a very difficult topic. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danie, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to spend a bit of time with you guys this afternoon. Thank you also for everybody that's given up some of their time past 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I hope it will be valuable to you as well. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So give me 1 second. Let me just put that in place. Right, you guys are now supposed to see my screen without anything on the sides or at the bottom. Is that the case, Danie? Okay, perfect. Right, ladies and gentlemen, Danie mentioned in his introduction that soft issues or soft skills are very often the things that are overlooked, and that in the end could actually lead to your project being unsuccessful if they are overlooked, or your company not achieving its goals. We have a saying in our space that soft skills are the hard skills. And we say that because it is very often a lot easier to teach somebody a coding language, or to teach somebody a new process, or to teach somebody a new way of doing things than it is to change behavior. And for that reason, that which is very often regarded as soft skills actually become the things that are a little bit more difficult, but yet no less crucial than the hard skills, irrespective of which environment you are in. We, as an organization, have quite a number of clients in the engineering space, in which you guys work a lot in mining and metallurgy. And we find that engineers, quite ironically, actually enjoy the frameworks that we provide, because it gives you something tangible. It gives you a framework that you can use to adjust and to adapt behavior, which obviously is, as you guys, most of you being engineers, I would assume, would know that is very, very handy. So this afternoon, we're going to look a little bit at behavior, and then specifically start looking into a behavior model or a behavior framework, as I said earlier on, and then try to apply that to the current situation in which we find ourselves, which is one where a lot of people are working remotely. Some people have obviously returned to offices, but I think you guys will agree that the pandemic around the world over the last 18 months has actually changed the way in which we look at work, with companies rethinking whether it's necessary to have people in offices, and more companies moving remotely. We as an organization, since the start of the pandemic 18 months ago, have had a number of people recruited in South Africa who work for our UK head office, but they're located in South Africa, because we realize that we've got fantastic skills down here. Sorry, I say down simply because of the geographical makeup of the globe. And obviously the time difference is not that much between the UK and South Africa. And that has allowed us to really rethink the way in which we operate as an organization. And I think we're not alone in that. I think a lot of other organizations are doing exactly the same thing. The behavior model that I'm going to be using today is very simple, very straightforward, but at the same time, that does not make it less valid and less reliable. This particular instrument that we're talking about today, the personal profile analysis, has been validated extensively over the last 30 years, and is currently registered with the Health Professions Council of South Africa as a valid assessment that can be used both in the recruitment and development of individuals. Just a little bit more about Thomas. As Danie said in the beginning, we operate in just over 60 countries around the globe at the moment. We've been in South Africa since the late 80s. So quite a substantial time that we've spent with clients in South Africa specifically. And our client base includes everybody from the big banks right through to people running 2 or 3 man consulting businesses. And the purpose and aim of our organization is to enable managers and organizations to manage their people better, whether that means recruiting the right talent, whether that means developing those people into the ideal roles that we want them to be in, whether it's succession planning, whether it's employee engagement, pretty much anything related to human behavior and the understanding of the different aspects. We're only going to look at behavior today, but I will make 1 or 2 references to some other aspects, such as emotional intelligence, for instance, personality, which Danie also mentioned in his introduction, cognitive ability, and all those things obviously need to be taken into consideration, whether you are recruiting or developing or managing people. But for today's purpose, we are only going to look at behavior. As Danie said, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen is available. If you want to pop some questions in there, please feel free to do so. And I will address those at the end, and then we'll be using the chat box during the presentation and the conversation. I really want to make it as interactive as possible. So I'm going to pose a few questions to you guys, and then I'm going to ask you to put your responses in the chat box so that I can see it and respond to it in real time. Right, so let's look a little bit at behavior. Many of you may have heard of a theory or an assessment that is based on the DISC model. So DISC is an acronym which spells dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. And just to make it very clear in the beginning, the DISC model, the theory of DISC, is in the public domain. We do not own the rights to DISC. But a word of caution, the fact that anybody can make a car doesn't mean that all cars are equal. I know that there will be a lot of debates about whether if you're a 4x4 person, you know, whether it's a Toyota or a Land Rover or a Nissan. When you're into sports cars, whether it's a Mercedes or whether it's a Porsche or something else. And in the same way, within the disc area, you will find a lot of assessments. You can go onto the internet and find something free of charge, probably, that is based on the disc model. But I have to caution, if something is not valid and reliable and shown to be such, you're at risk of using something that could, you know, leave you stranded by the roadside, to go back to the car analogy that I used earlier. Right. So also, as we said earlier on, DISC looks at behavior. Danie also mentioned that this is different from personality. So for most of us, your personality would be relatively set around the time of your mid-20s. Personality, if you think about an iceberg, personality would be that which is under the surface of the waterline. So that which is not necessarily seen by others, but it's the big mass of who you are as a human being. Behavior is that which is observable above the waterline, that which other people see when they interact with you on a daily basis. And obviously your personality would influence your behavior. But it's very, very important to keep in mind that we have a choice as to how we are going to behave in any given situation. If I can recommend a book very, very early on in the discussion, there's a book by a psychiatrist called Viktor Frankl. The book is entitled Man's Search for Meaning, and I would highly recommend. It's a very short read. You can finish it on a Saturday. But it's something that really stresses that point about you are not a slave to your own behavior. You have a choice in terms of how you are going to react to different impulses and how you are going to adapt your behavior in different situations. Okay, so let's look at the origins of this a little bit. During the early 1900s, there were quite a few psychologists and psychiatrists around the world that tried to understand abnormal behavior. People like Freud, people like Jung, those guys were looking at why do people go off the rails, so to speak? Why do we have personality disorders, and why do people act in abnormal ways in certain times? A psychiatrist, by the way, by the name of William Moulton Marston, at that same time was actually looking at the emotions and behaviors of normal people as opposed to abnormal behavior. So very important to stress in the beginning, DISC as a framework and the PPA as an instrument is not concerned with abnormal behavior. We're looking at the behavior of the people on this call, the people that you work with, the people that you live with, your family, your colleagues. And we're trying to create a framework so we can understand our own and other people's behavior better. Just as a side note, William Moulton Marston was a very interesting character. He was also the guy that invented Wonder Woman and was an avid cartoonist and wrote all the stories involving Wonder Woman around the early 1900s as well. But obviously the main focus of his work, as far as we're concerned, is around the behaviors of normal people. So Marston basically says that we view the world in one of two ways. Some of us look at the world and what we see, what we perceive around us is a hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic environment. Now, it's very important to consider the word perceived there. It's about your perception of the world around you. Some of us would perceive it as hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic, while others would actually perceive the world around you as friendly and favorable. And this then leads to a continuum. You could have two children growing up in Afghanistan, and one of them perceives the world around them as hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic, and the other one, who plays in the same dirty streets, perceives the world as a friendly and favorable way. And the reason for that is something which the psychologists refer to as a combination of nature and nurture. So some of our personality traits, some of our behavioral preferences actually come from our parents, and they are genetic in nature. But some of those actually come from the way in which we are brought up, from the way in which we interact with other people from a very early age in our lives. And for that reason, you could have two people in the same environment, with one having a perception of that environment being hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic, and somebody else having a perception of the same environment as friendly and favorable. And as I said, that then leads to a continuum, and all of us are somewhere on this line between that hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic world and the friendly and favorable perception of the world. We then react to that world in either an active or a passive way. So an active reaction to a hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic environment would look different from an active reaction to a friendly or favorable environment. And similarly, a passive reaction to either hostility or friendliness would look very, very different. And that is in the end how we get to the 4 quadrants. And as you can see in the top left-hand corner, we have dominance. The key word there, or as we refer to it, the P word. We attach a P word to each of these to make it easier to understand. The P word for dominance is power. So dominance is essentially an active reaction to a perceived hostile, friendly, and antagonistic world around you. So if you think about somebody that faces hostility and then fights against that hostility, that would give you a good indication of what dominance is all about. In the bottom left-hand quadrant, we would have somebody that perceives the world as a friendly or favorable place and then react actively to that. And we call that influence. And the P word there is people. So this person has a different perception of the world, but their reaction is also active, same as the dominant person. But then obviously the behavior is going to be very different because one perceives the world as hostile and the other one perceives the world as friendly and favorable. In the bottom right-hand corner or quadrant, we would have a passive reaction to a friendly and favorable environment. So somebody that looks at the world around them and subconsciously sees it as friendly and favorable, and their reaction to that is passive, we call that steadiness. And the P word there is pace. I think it makes sense if you logically think about the fact that if I perceive the world as friendly and favorable, I would not necessarily want to change that. I would like it to remain steady. And the pace there, very important to note that if somebody has a high level of steadiness in their behavioral preference, that means that they prefer to do things a little bit slower, but more thoroughly. Whereas somebody with a low level of steadiness prefers to do something more quickly. So there's an inverse correlation between steadiness and pace. High steadiness means slower pace, and low steadiness means higher pace. And then the final one, compliance. So somebody that perceives the world as hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic, but has a passive reaction to that, we would call that compliance. And the P word there would be policy. So if you look at the dominance and compliance parts, I said earlier on that somebody with a dominance behavioral preference would fight against the hostility, whereas somebody with a high level of compliance in their behavior would use that compliance to protect themselves against the hostility in a non-antagonistic way, to try and avoid the antagonism, the hostility, and the unfriendliness that they perceive in the world around them. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot see myself, so I'm just going to try and change that if I can. I cannot. Yeah, there we go. Okay, brilliant. Sorry, I'm just going to run through them again. Right, so my first question for all of you would be, if you look at dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance, if you look at the 4 quadrants of behavior and you consider where each of them come from, Dominance being an active reaction to a hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic environment. What kind of behaviors are we likely to see from somebody with that preference? And this is where I want you to go into the chat box, and you can add things into the chat box, but I'm looking for specific behaviors. Let's do one-word behaviors. We're not looking for sentences and essays. Give me behaviors that you think you would see from somebody with a dominant behavioral style, where power is key, and that is an active reaction to hostility, unfriendliness, and antagonism. What kind of behaviors are we likely to observe from that person? Right, we have stern, we have command, we have fight, we have talkative, authoritative. What else? What other behaviors? Controlling, yes. Remember, it's about power, so they like to be in control. We have aggressive, we have forceful, we have dictatorial. Right, a D leader. Johan, I like that word. Okay, brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, you are definitely on the right track here. I'm going to show you those behaviors in a little while, but most of the ones that I see on my screen in front of me are absolutely spot on. If we then, oh, megalomania, Mark, thank you for that one. Yes, power hungry. The key word there is power, as we said. These people like to be in control, so that makes absolute sense. Right. If we then move to the bottom left-hand quadrant, and if we ask the question, if somebody perceives the world as a friendly and favorable place, and they have an active reaction to that, what kind of behaviors do you think we are likely to see from that individual? The behavioral style is influence, and the key word to help you there a little bit is people. Jim, you're absolutely spot on. They are negotiators. Neil, you're correct. They are high on encouragement. We very often refer to them as cheerleaders. They're the people that really encourage others and, you know, use language of praise and communication. Brilliant. Thank you, Xavier and Johan. What other behaviors are we likely to see? Mark, you're right. Consultative, sociable, absolutely, Richard. These people like to be surrounded by other people. They are social animals, and they very often like to be the center of attention and to be part of that social circle. Tineke, you're right. They will strive for consensus. They are team workers, absolutely. Anything else that anybody can think of? Okay, I think we've got the idea. So people with a high influence, we refer to them as people. They like to be surrounded by people. They like to be part of a group. They are social animals. Now, while extroversion and introversion are personality traits, and we spoke in the beginning about the difference between personality and behavior, we very often find a very high correlation between high levels of influence and high levels of extroversion. So if you think of an extrovert, the chances are very, very good that you will see the kinds of behavior that we had in the chat box here, and that person is very likely to be high on influence. Right. If we move to the bottom right-hand quadrant, now remember, we're still talking about somebody that sees the world as a friendly and favorable place. Their perception is of, you know, this is a good place to be, but their reaction to that is more passive. So we refer to that as steadiness, and we said that there's an inverse correlation between steadiness and pace. So people that fall into this quadrant in terms of their behavioral preference are likely to be a little bit slower paced. What kind of behaviors do you think we will observe from people that fall into that quadrant? Yes, Mark, they do not like conflict. They are likely to be accepting of others. Absolutely correct. What else? What kind of behaviors would we see? Karabo, you are absolutely correct that they are reserved in the sense that they tend to listen, rather than talk. They prefer to be more passive in their communication as well. Jim, you are spot on. They are reliable because they are very consistent in their approach. Because they are slower paced and steady, they essentially do what they said they would do. Shadvin, you are correct. They are peacekeepers. They don't like conflict. They are loyal. Mark, yes, you are right. They can be followers, especially in an unfamiliar environment. But be assured that once this person becomes an expert in their environment, they can very much be a leader and a very good leader. Yes, Mark, they are introspective. Richard, I like the word brotherly. You are absolutely correct. These people, incidentally, prefer smaller groups of people and would have deeper relationships with a small circle of friends rather than those that are high on influence that we saw in the previous quadrant, who tend to be comfortable in crowds and with large groups of people around them. And harmonious, absolutely, Xavier, you are correct. They try to keep the peace, essentially, because they don't like people being upset with them. Right, brilliant. I think you guys probably studied this before, because I am very, very impressed with the answers. Well done so far. Let's move to the top right-hand quadrant. So here we have somebody who perceives the world as a hostile, unfriendly, and antagonistic place. But their reaction to that is to use compliance to try and avoid the hostility, to try and avoid the conflict, to try and, avoid that unfriendly, antagonistic world around them. For that reason, the key word is policy. And there's a very good reason for that we'll get to in a minute. But let's look at behavior first. What kind of behaviors do you guys think we will see from people that have a high preference for compliance in their behavior? More than my job's worth. Julian, you are absolutely right. They can very often be legalistic. They follow the letter of the law, not necessarily the spirit of the law. They can be bureaucratic because of that. Mark, you're right. They're also likely to be reserved, like the high S's that we had in the previous one. Jim, you are correct. They are likely to conforming to rules, regulations, and the norms. Neil, spot on. They are detail-oriented. They tend to write you emails that are pages and pages long because they don't want to leave anything out. And Richard, you are correct. They can be uncompromising in their following of the policy or their following of the rule or their regulation. Right. Anybody else? Anything else that anybody can think of? Compliance? Johan, you are absolutely correct. They are quality-oriented people. Because they delve into the detail and because they want to get things right, they will go over something over and over again in order to ensure that the quality is of the desired standard. If I can ask the question, just as a matter of interest, can anybody think of a public figure within the South African or global context that would be high on dominance? If you think of public figures, somebody that you can think of that would have this power approach to the world around them, who comes to mind? Which public figures come to mind? Absolutely, Mark. Thank you very much. Donald Trump made our lives a lot easier in helping people around the globe to understand dominance because he is the epitome of dominance. Mark, you're right. The crocodile with a finger, definitely. Behavioural was also very much a high dominance individual. Johan, I'm not sure who Natasha Viljoen is. I'm not sure if I've been living in a cave or under a rock, but I can't comment on Natasha because I'm not sure who she is. Apologies. Politicians. We will find a lot of these guys in politicians. Mr. Red Beret in the South African political environment is definitely a high dominance person as well. Malema. And I am going to have to swallow my tongue quickly if I just mentioned Natasha Viljoen and Julius Malema in the same sentence. I think I am in serious trouble. Sorry about that. Yes, Karabo, I think you're right. Shaka definitely had the dominance power type of approach. Okay, if we look at influence, what public figures can you guys think of, either in South Africa or around the world, that have this outgoing, extroverted, influential type of approach, where they're friendly but active in their friendliness with other people? Can anybody think of someone that has this friendly approach? Yes, Boris Johnson. I actually do know who Andre de Ruyter is. Yes, I think you're right. He absolutely has that much more friendly approach as well. Well, in front of the cameras, definitely. Anybody can think of anyone else? Mr. Virgin? Richard Branson, thank you very much, Mark. As I was saying it, Richard Branson, definitely a high I. So you will always recognize a high I because they draw the spotlight. They make sure that you notice them. They make sure that you know exactly who they are and what their opinions about things are, but in a friendly type of approach, whereas the dominant person can do it in a very blunt way. Okay, if we think about public figures that are high on steadiness, Mark, I'm going to get back to your comment about Boris Johnson being a high D. I think there's some truth in that. I'm just going to park that for a moment, and then I'll get back to that. So can you guys think of any public figures that are high on steadiness? People that are dependable in their approach, people that are a little bit more slow paced. Yes, I think Cyril Ramaphosa probably has some steadiness in his profile. Neil, I think you're right. Anybody else think of any people with high steadiness? Angela Merkel, the German, oh, Jim, yes, the Queen of England. I think she is a whiter shade of pale sometimes as the song goes, because of the high level of steadiness. Obama is an interesting character. I personally think he had some dominance, but he realized it early in his career, and he realized that he had to adjust his approach. So the behavior that we see from Obama is very, very much more the combination of influence and steadiness than the dominance, which I think was underlying it. Right, and then if we move to compliance, can anybody think of a figure or a public person that is high on compliance, on policy? Joe Biden, most probably, yes. I would agree with that. Anybody in the South African context that you guys can think of that would be high on compliance, high on policy? Thank you, Jim. Absolutely right. Pravin Gordhan, if you look at his appearance, if you even look at the fact that his tie is never out of place, you can pull him through a ring, so to speak. He is absolutely perfect in his delivery, but precise and accurate and logical in his approach. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That was a bit of a guessing game, just for fun, just to give you an idea and to get your mind going around the different quadrants. Going back to the comment that somebody made about Boris Johnson, Mark, thank you for that. Important to mention, and I think I may have neglected to do so in the beginning, most people are a combination of 2 or 3 different behavioral preferences in their style. So when we refer to somebody as being a high D, i.e. high dominance, it's very likely that that person will have some other factor in their profile as well. So statistically, we find that the vast majority of people have 2 factors in their profile, normally a combination of 2 that are next to each other. So DI or DC or CS or IS. And sorry, when I referred to the letters, I literally referred to the first letter of that profile. So DI would be a combination of dominance and influence. CS would be a combination of compliance and steadiness. The vast majority of people have a combination of 2 factors that they prefer over the others. And then next in line, statistically, we actually have people that have a combination of 3 factors. Whereas somebody with only 1 factor that they strongly prefer over the others are quite a bit more rare. Richard, your question about Nelson Mandela is a very interesting one. Now, remember, once again, we said that behavior is about the way in which you choose to act. I was too young to really, well, obviously I saw it in history and in videos and everything else. I personally think that Nelson Mandela had a lot of dominance and influence in his profile in his early life before he went to jail. But when he came out, he definitely was a combination of more the steadiness and the influence in his approach. I see a lot of correlations between Obama and Mandela in terms of the way in which they approach people, that peacemaker mentality, the whole idea of, yes, we need to get things done, but we need to take people with us on the journey rather than upset them along the way. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for that. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to give you an idea. Sorry, Mike. Clicker, oh yes, sorry, my clicker was not working there for a second. So we're going to have a quick look at what motivates people in each of these quadrants. And that very often relates to the P word that you see in brackets underneath. So if I can ask the question, what do you think would motivate somebody with a high level of dominance? What would it be that they would be after more than anything else? What would they try to achieve through their behavior? What would be their main motivator? Any ideas? Power, control. Yes, Mark, Neil, you are absolutely spot on. So for a high dominant person, it's about having the power, having the control, and being in charge. For somebody with high levels of steadiness, any ideas what the motivator would be for somebody with a high level of steadiness? Somebody with a high, sorry, I said steadiness, my mistake, ladies and gentlemen, sorry, I'm looking at influence. So those people that are the people, the highly influential ones, what do you think they would be motivated by more than anything else? They enjoy being around people. They enjoy social interaction. They like to be the center of attention. Not quite yet. Harmony is going to come in a little bit later. So it's about the active social involvement. It's about being the center of attention. Can anybody think of a word that would encompass that? They do like to win. They do like to be the leader, but so does the high D. There's something. Oh, Julian, you're getting very close. Julian is very, very close when he talks about popularity. So the thing that somebody with a high I likes more than anything else is specifically about praise and recognition, but I'm going to qualify that. It's about public praise and recognition. We always joke and say the worst thing you can do with somebody with a high I when they've done a good job is to take them into your office, close the door, and when nobody else can see them, tell them how fantastic they are. They actually want that to happen on a public stage. They're the type of people that enjoy absolutely, Shadvin, you're right. They enjoy fame. They enjoy the idea of being the center of attention and getting the recognition that goes with that. Right, if we think about steadiness, the bottom right-hand corner, if you guys think back to that, that's about steadiness, people that they like the status quo, they want to maintain what they see as a friendly and favorable environment. What do you think would be their motivator? What would they, oh yes, thank you very much, Ian. You're absolutely spot on with the first one. They are motivated by security. And now we need to clarify here, it's not necessarily burglar bars and alarm systems. It's about the security of knowing what's coming so that they can prepare for it and that they are not caught off guard. If we have time in the end, remind me, Danie, to tell you the story about my wife and I and the trip to Paris when we were newlyweds. Make a note of that, please. If we have time at the end, I'd love to tell you that story to illustrate the difference between the different behavioral motivators. Right, and then the final one, if we talk about somebody with a high level of compliance, what would they be motivated by? What is it that they want to achieve? What is it that actually gets them to a point where they go, great, this is what I was looking for? Any ideas? Perfection, you're on the right track, Mark, but perfection and accuracy, as Neil says, according to what? According to whom? So what is there? How do you measure the perfection or the accuracy that somebody with a high level of compliance is looking for? To be right, Ian, you are right, but there's something else. To be right according to whom? Any ideas? A standard, Karabu, you're right. I'm going to give it to you guys. It's about standard operating procedures. So it's very often interesting if you look at this list and you are a high D, you're a high on power and authority. You cannot imagine that standard operating procedures could actually motivate somebody. But that's because they're different from you. And if you're a high C, you cannot imagine how praise and recognition could motivate somebody, because people with a high S and people with a high C very often don't like the limelight. They don't like to be called up to the stage at the end of year function and receive an award. They want it to be more sincere. They're actually the guys that you take into the office and you close the door and you thank them in private than in person, because they see that as a more sincere form of praise. Okay. Right, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on from there. So motivators for the high dominant person is power and authority. For the high I is praise and recognition. For the high S is security. And for the high C is standard operating procedures. I hope by this stage you're trying to get a picture in your head of the fact that people have very, very different behavioral preferences. And because of that, they are motivated in very, very different ways. And the danger is that we try to motivate and manage people according to our own preferences. I might like praise and recognition because I'm a high I, and then I heap public praise and recognition on somebody who's a high C. And in the process, I actually alienate them because they see it as insincere. They see it as shallow. And what they want is to be given standard operating procedures to ensure that they can stick to those and that they know exactly what's expected of them. Right, similarly, and I'm going to run through these in the interest of time, rather than ask you guys for them. The high D loves power, fears failure. I think that makes quite a lot of sense. The high I loves public praise and recognition and fears rejection. Now, none of us like to be rejected, but the high I less than anybody else. They absolutely hate that situation where they are chosen last for the team in school. You know, when you choose sports teams and you have two leaders and each leader has to choose a player. The high I's biggest fear is that he or she will be the last one to be chosen. Irrespective of their ability, they do not want to be rejected. The high S, we said, is motivated by security and they fear insecurity. They fear an environment where they don't know what's coming, where they can't prepare for something and to be caught unprepared or unawares. And then the high C actually fears conflict more than anything else. Remember, we said that the high compliance is a result of a passive reaction to an antagonistic perception or perceived antagonistic of the world around them, perceived antagonism. And therefore, what they try to achieve through the standard operating procedure is to stay away from conflict. They don't like people fighting with them or fighting with each other for that matter. From this, we also can start looking at communication styles. So somebody with a high D, somebody mentioned Pierre Botha earlier on, we were talking about high Ds. And very often you would see the finger come out when a high D is addressing a group of people. This is what I expect of you. It's my way or the highway. I'm telling you now, do not, cross me or whatever the case is. Those are very often the high D communication styles. The high I, on the other hand, likes talking. They like verbal communication. They like trying to convince you to their point of view in a friendly way. The high S is more the listener. Remember, the more passive, slower paced approach. They're the ones that listen to all the different opinions and then don't necessarily even speak their mind because they absorb everything. And then the high Cs, very interesting one, they prefer to communicate in writing. And I'd be very interested to see if anybody can give me a reason why the high compliance individual prefers to communicate in writing rather than verbal communication. Any ideas? You can write it in the chat box. Why do high compliant people prefer communication in writing? Absolutely, it gives them time to think over their answers, avoid conflict. Writing is exact. There you go. Karabu is absolutely spot on. All the others are correct, but it's about keeping records so as to avoid conflict at a later stage. If you and I have a conversation and we have a disagreement later on about what was said, that could lead to conflict. And high Cs don't like conflict. So if we put it in writing, then the conflict is, or the potential for conflict is absolutely reduced. So yes, you're absolutely right, everybody. It's about avoiding risk, proof of SOPs, and so on and so forth. It's essentially about proof, communicating in writing. Right. So what we have here, and you guys will receive my presentation in PDF format afterwards, so you're welcome to take a screenshot if you want. But this is essentially a list of consistent characteristics for all the 4 factors. So we've got dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. And very important to note what I said earlier on, that most people are a combination of 2 or 3 of these factors, with what we call a leading factor, which would be the strongest preference out of the 4, and then either 1 or 2 other factors that would be in the blue area. And then the factors that they don't have a strong preference for would be in the green area at the bottom. Now, it's important to understand this in the right way, ladies and gentlemen. That which is above the line, the white line in the middle is the one that I'm referring to, the big, thick white line. That which is above the line, we refer to as your working strengths. So if you think of a tree, that which is above the ground, the branches and the trunk and the leaves and all of that, those would be your working strengths. But a tree also needs roots, otherwise it's going to fall over. And that which is below the line are referred to as your supporting factors. They are not negative, they are not weaknesses, but you need those in order to drive the working strengths at the top. And as you go through them, you will see that the D is all about results, and they tend to be assertive, competitive, driving, direct, forceful, inquisitive, and self-starters. If somebody does not have a preference for dominance in their behavior, it means that they're looking for direction at the bottom here. And that means that you would find them more accommodating, hesitant, a lower decision need. They don't always need to be in control and make the decisions. They tend to be more mild-mannered and non-demanding. I hope that makes sense to everybody. In the same way, the I is all about people and relationships, and therefore we find these consistent characteristics about communicative, friendly, influential, networker, persuasive, positive, and verbal. But very often, somebody with a low level of influence in their behavioral style would look at that person and say, but I'm looking for reality. And this looks quite fluffy up here. The friendly, influential networker approach, very often to somebody who is more introverted, somebody who doesn't necessarily enjoy being around large groups of people all the time, could be, they could see that as superficial and shallow. And we very often find people with a low preference for influence to be probing, reflective, reserved, self-conscious, serious, and suspicious, especially of those with high I's or a high level of I in their profile. So a high level of steadiness is all about service and specialist type of roles. And we find those people to be amiable, deliberate, dependable, good listeners, kind, methodical, persistent, and thorough. Whereas somebody with a low level of steadiness in their behavioral preference would seek variety. And therefore we would find them to be active, alert, demonstrative, mobile, and restless. And then the final one, We heard the word quality and policy used when we were talking about the high Cs, the high compliance. And that means that they are accurate, careful, compliant, logical, perfectionist, precise, and systematic. Whereas somebody with a low level of compliance in their behavioral preference would be firm, independent, persistent, strong-willed, and sometimes even stubborn. Now, if you look at these 4 quadrants and the fact that all of them have descriptors above or characteristics above the line and below the line, you can now start thinking about different combinations. So somebody can have a high level of dominance and high level of influence and even high level of compliance combined with a low level of steadiness. And that means that that person would have all the characteristics of the high dominance, all the characteristics of the high influence, combined with being active, alert, demonstrative, mobile, and restless, and then all the characteristics of a high level of compliance. Similarly, you could have somebody that we would refer to as a CS combination, somebody with a high level of quality or preference for compliance and a high level of preference for steadiness. And you would find these groups of characteristics combined with the ones below the line as far as dominance and influence are concerned, because they have lower levels of preference for those specifically. Right, and as I said, this will be sent to you in PDF format. So if you have any questions, you can pop them in the Q&A box, and we will attend to those after the presentation as part of the Q&A. Right, so the question then becomes, what do we do, or how do we apply this within the environment in which we're working at the moment? So each of these factors or each of these preferences that people have different challenges to overcome when you're working remotely. And I hope by this time you're starting to get an idea in your own head of what your behavior preferences are and which of these quadrants you have a strong preference for and which of those you have a low preference for, which of those you don't necessarily identify with. So somebody with a high level of dominance, if they start working remotely, they may often feel lost and disempowered, because especially in something like a sales role where we find a lot of people with high dominance, they could find it very difficult to deliver the results that they normally would. And because of that, they are likely to experience frustration, and they could become a little bit more blunt in their communication. A high I, on the other hand, remember we said that they like to be around groups of people. And for that reason, working remotely for a high I can be extremely challenging because they do not have access to people to discuss ideas. These are the types of people who love walking around the office and having impromptu conversations with people about things and asking questions around the water cooler or the coffee machine. And they are likely to experience loneliness and boredom if you don't check in with them on a regular basis when they are working remotely. People with a high level of steadiness, support is extremely important to them, and they could feel isolated if their support networks aren't accessible. And the fact that the pandemic came as a sudden change was actually quite challenging for people with a high level of steadiness, because I'm used to going into my office and working in the office. And now suddenly the president comes on air and he says that for the next 7 weeks, I'm not allowed to go into the office. And those 7 weeks turn into 7 months. And now it's 18 months later and I've not been back to the office yet. And that is a very challenging change for people with a high level of steadiness. Interestingly, when people start going back to the office after 18 months, the high S's could find it difficult to return to the office because they have now become comfortable or accustomed to the way in which things actually now work. This has become the new norm for them. Somebody mentioned the word norm when we were talking about high level of steadiness earlier on. And therefore, they are likely to experience anxiety and stress if they're not supported. And in the same way, once we start returning to the office, they could have that same anxiety and stress because of the changing situation. And then the high compliance, their productivity could drop if they don't have clear guidelines. So if they had a manager that was managing them very hands-on previously and telling them what to do and advising them and who they could consult with in the office, now having to be far away from that person could be difficult for them as well. Interestingly, we find that people with high levels of compliance tend to adapt to technology very quickly, because it's about detail and process and policy and those type of things. So once again, if we can use the technology to provide them with clarity, then that could help them a lot. Right. So let's have a quick look at adapting your style. So as I said earlier, I hope each of you have an idea now of more or less what your behavioral preferences are within this framework. And by the way, at the end of the presentation, I will give you an email address that you can contact us on. If you actually want to do the assessment yourself, I'm happy to give that complimentary to everybody on this call. So you can then go through the assessment and you can see what your own behavioral preference is. If you are communicating with a high D, especially from a distance, it's very important to give them regular but concise updates. That can be in the form of a call, or it can be in writing. Just make sure that it's short, because these guys are about doom, doom, doom. I want to get things done. I want quick results, especially if the high D doesn't have a C in his or her profile. Don't write them an email of 17 pages. They're going to read the first 7 lines and then they're going to miss the rest. We need to be able to adapt to that. Okay. The high I, the high influence, they need face-to-face interaction. And with technology, obviously, we're talking to each other technically face-to-face at the moment, even though we're distributed in various different parts of Gauteng. And it's very important that we utilize that technology. High eyes like to see people. They're the type of people, when you're on a call, their camera is on because they want to interact. They have this social need, and they prefer to see somebody. And impromptu catch-ups, those kind of things work with them very, very well. They need to be given time to talk as well. Remember, they're verbal communicators. They like to talk with people, and you need to give them an opportunity to verbalize what's in their minds. The high S's, we need to give them structure. You need to structure calls with them, whether it's face-to-face or on Zoom or on the telephone or whichever way you do it. The important thing there is that they should know that I have a check-in with my manager on a Thursday morning at 8 o'clock, or on a daily basis at 9 o'clock, or whatever the case is, whatever the frequency need is for that kind of communication. It's very important that you give them focused, uninterrupted time, especially with Zoom and Teams and everything else. It becomes very difficult because people would be on a Zoom call and they would grab their phone and they'd start, texting people and those kind of things. And to a high S, that could be hugely frustrating because they're all about sincerity. They really want to know that you are paying attention to them and that what they say and the time that you spend with them is important. And for that reason, it's important to focus on the support that you give to them. And then as far as the high C is concerned, remember, it's about detail. It's about giving the detailed updates, making sure that they've got the materials in advance of face-to-face catch-ups. It's actually quite interesting. I have regular catch-ups with everybody in our organization. Obviously, those that report to me on a weekly basis and those that don't on a monthly or quarterly basis. And very often a high C I would schedule a call with them and I haven't spoken to them in a few weeks on a one-to-one situation because they're working in a different team. And they would write me an email beforehand saying, so what's the agenda? And my response is very often, I just want to catch up with you. And the person would go, what do you want to catch up about? What are the detailed points? Because I want to prepare. And they want the detail of the conversation before the conversation even takes place. Right. How to support them? For the high Ds, we need to adapt their targets and performance matrix, allow them to feel a sense of success, and give them the power to achieve their results. For the high Is, we need to give them opportunities to interact. Remember, they're the social animals. They want to interact with people. And simple things like Friday, we have a call from 12 to 1. It's lunchtime. Everybody brings their lunch to the call. and we have a social discussion. For somebody with a low level of influence, that could be, why do you want to do that? I mean, we've got work to do. But for the high I, that is extremely important, through whether it's video conferences or webinars or whatever the case is. They want that social interaction, not just about the work all the time. Okay, the high S's, the high steadiness, they need the forums to allow them to collaborate with others. They are also very people focused, but for them it's about the structure, as we said earlier on. Remind them that they are connected even though it's over a distance, and that the structure is still in place, and that we can still follow the same process that we did earlier on. And then the high compliance, it's important that they are involved in the definition of the process. They need to know exactly what is expected of them. And as I said earlier on, when you start moving back to the office at some point, they need to know, what are the policies? There's a virus going around. So what's the policy for me to return to the office? What's the policy if I think that I've been in contact with somebody? Now, all of our organizations obviously have these in place. But for the high C's, it's absolutely important that we go through all the details of that with them. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, and that brings us to questions. But before I give you an opportunity for questions, I am going to tell you the story of my wife and I and our trip to Paris, just to illustrate the point. So what I'm going to do here before I tell the story is I'm going to go back to this slide with the consistent characteristics. So my wife and I were married quite early. So this took place about 25 years ago already. And we were living in London at the time, and we wanted to see the world. We went on a working holiday visa at the time, as many other South Africans of our age did. And a few weeks after arriving in the UK, I was on the tube one morning on my way into work, and I saw an advert in a newspaper for a 2-for-1 ticket on the Eurostar to Paris. The Eurostar being the train that goes under the English Channel to France, to Paris, and beyond from there. And I immediately thought, this is a great way to impress my wife. I'm a romantic husband. My wife would love a weekend in Paris. So I am going to purchase 2 tickets for us to go spend a weekend in Paris. However, when I phoned the company, when I got into the office, they made it very clear that this particular weekend was the only weekend, or the last weekend of the special offer. Now, this is Friday morning, and I decide, well, my wife would love a surprise. So I am going to book 2 tickets for the 2 of us to go to Paris for the weekend. I'm not going to tell my wife about this. I'm not going to ask her, because I'm a romantic husband and women like surprises. So feel free to comment anything in the chat box if you wish at this stage, ladies and gentlemen, especially those of you that are in relationships, whether you think that was a good idea or a bad idea at this stage. Now, let me make it clear, my intentions were pure. I wanted to take my wife to Paris for a weekend. Please indicate, Jim says it's high risk. Yes, Jim, you're absolutely right, as will become abundantly clear quite quickly. Danie says, oops, yes, right. I was young, I was 25 years old, and I thought my wife would absolutely love a weekend in Paris. So I booked the tickets, but I didn't tell her about it. That evening, that afternoon, I took off early from work because my wife was a teacher and she came home around 2:30, 3 o'clock, and the train would depart at 5. So I took a half day's leave and I walked into the house and I said to her, "My Liffy, I've got a surprise for you." And her eyes lit up. I love surprises. What's the surprise? I said, "We're going to Paris." And she goes, "That sounds really nice." And keywords, "When did you have in mind?" And my response was, "Well, right now. The train leaves in 2 hours. We need to pack our bags and get to the station very, very quickly." And my wife's reaction was, she froze, And then the tears started running down her cheeks after a few seconds. Initially, I thought they were tears of joy because I'm such an amazing husband, and she couldn't believe that I had, done this, and such a fantastic surprise, and she's always wanted to go to Paris. However, lo and behold, it became clear very quickly when she started crying full out that those were not tears of joy. Those were tears of absolute fear and astonishment that I could do something like this without talking to her first. And I said to her, "Don't you want to go to Paris?" And she said, "Of course I want to go to Paris, but I can't go to Paris right now. I've got other plans for the weekend." And so it turned out on a Sunday morning, we were involved in a South African church in London. That Sunday, it was her turn to look after the kids during the service. And she says to me, "Well, I can't because I need to look after the kids at church on Sunday morning." And I said to her, "My liefie, I'm sure you can find somebody else." And she says, "No, I can't do that. I can't expect somebody else to just stand in for me with a day and a half notice." And it turned into a big argument, and it was a very high risk, as Jim said earlier on, for me to pull that kind of stunt. In the end, we didn't go to Paris. We lost the tickets. We did go to Paris a few times because we stayed in the UK for 10 years. But that particular weekend, we did not go to Paris. However, I learned a hell of a lot about my wife in that whole experience. And to give you a bit of an insight, so you understand where this conflict came from, my profile is a combination of dominance and influence. I'm a DI profile. So it's about results and it's about people for me. Achieving results with and through people is essentially the summary of my behavior. That means that I am also a low S. I've got low steadiness. So my behavior includes things like being active, alert, demonstrative, mobile, and restless. I like variety. And I also have a low C in my profile. Well, I had at that stage. That's risen over the last 20 years or so. So I was very firm, independent, persistent, strong-willed, and stubborn. My wife, on the other hand, is a very high S. Her S, thank you very much, Johan, you are absolutely correct. Her profile is an SC combination, which means that she is amiable, deliberate, dependable, good listener, kind, methodical, persistent, and thorough, but she is not active, alert, mobile, and restless. And she is accurate, careful, compliant, precise, logical, systematic. So I hope this story illustrates the fact that even though my intentions were pure and her intentions were pure, it still led to substantial conflict in our relationship on the day. The story does have a happy ending, though. We're still married 25 years later. And because I now know that my wife likes looking forward to things more than being surprised by them, our anniversary every year is in November. So what I do is I book something in May. After consultation with my wife, I show her all the different options on hotels.com or on Travel Start or something like that. And, we decide together where we're going to go. And then she's got 6 months to look forward to our anniversary. The nice part of it is because I've got a very low S, I forget all about it. So come November, I'm excited about a surprise anniversary that is coming my way. And my wife's been looking forward to it for 6 months, and everybody is happy. In exactly the same way that we have different behaviors between myself and my wife, I have different behaviors in my team. I have different people that prefer to have things done in different ways. And if I'm going to be a great manager, that means that I need to be able to adapt my behavior. I need to manage a high S differently from the way in which I manage a high D, because they're motivated by different things, they fear different things, and they've got different styles. Right, ladies and gentlemen, that is pretty much it as far as the presentation is concerned. I'm going to run through it again so you can see the contact details at the end. And while we do the Q&A, you guys are welcome to send an email to inquiries-sa@thomas.co. That is not a typing error. It shouldn't be thomas.com or thomas.co.za. It's just thomas.co. And then if you either want to do the assessment on a complementary basis or you're looking for more information about how we can assist you, then please feel free to send an email to us there. But I'm happy to take a few Q&As. Shall we have a look at what's in the Q&A box? Danie, are you driving that?
Yes, all right. I see we have a comment there. Thanks, Andries. Can you describe the difference, if any, between the DISC and the predictive index?
Okay, Mark, I'm unfortunately going to have to decline that. And the reason is that predictive index is a competitive assessment of ours. So that's a little bit like asking a Mercedes salesman to tell you about the differences between Mercedes and BMW. I do believe that predictive index is a very good assessment. I will say as much. I have a lot of respect for them, or for the company that distributes this specific assessment. But I can't go into the details in terms of, you know, what the specific differences would be. I'm just too biased to be able to do that. Sorry about that, Mark. Any other questions specifically?
Just from my side, in the beginning you talked about Viktor Frankl. What's that book's name again?
The book is called Man's Search for Meaning. And Frankl is spelled F-R-A-N-K-L. Viktor Frankl.
Man's Search for
Meaning.
All right. Hi guys, the floor is open. Andries, you know, while you were talking, I was looking at a lot of faces in front of me and trying to identify certain profiles, looking in the mirror and all those kind of things. And it's actually very interesting, especially when you look at your example with your wife. How many of our guys had the same kind of rally in ours? My assessment of the engineering species is that they are most of the time quite dominant in the what's the name, in the seaside, and and they also love the steadiness. But sometimes you have your blue engineers that is very dominant. So it's very interesting to in a previous life of mine, I had to influence the privilege to bring student engineers to the table from school after matric and so on. And it was for me very interesting to see, and very necessary to have them evaluated to see who's your blue, how you guys looking in your blue to red shade, and that brings you very close to this behavior matrix, and to see who, in principle, you can't put the blue engineer in charge of a work team. Everyone is going to resign. But you have that guy's skills necessarily you need it. So from management side, how are you going again? How are you going to manage your people as prominent tools to achieve your end result in your project? And again, if you look at this behavior matrix of yours as a mirror, you can see a lot of things that you do right and a lot of things that you do wrong. And sometimes unintentional hard saw that you bring to the table. And yes, it's really interesting. It's really, as I say, it's a soft issue for the engineering environment, but it's so necessary.
Yeah. No, Danie, you're absolutely correct. I see there's a question related to what you just said. Johan asks, have you ever used the DISC and MBTI in development or transformation? Yes, Johan, absolutely. So we believe that, as we said earlier on, behavior is a choice. The way in which you act in certain environments, obviously you have strong preferences, But if I'm going to be developing my people or developing my team, the first step is to understand people's behavioral preferences. We always say that 3 things are required for you to have a great relationship with anybody else. The first one is knowledge of yourself, your own preferences, and very importantly, part of that first one is, what is the impact that my behavior has on other people? A lot of dominant people are bulldozers, and they just don't realize it. Danie just mentioned that it's very often, it's not your intention to bulldoze somebody, but you do it unintentionally because you revert to your natural style if you're not aware of it. Okay? So the first thing that's required for a great relationship with anybody is knowledge of yourself and of your impact on the other person. The second one is knowledge of the other person's behavioral style. Now, obviously, that can be best achieved by doing an assessment like the PPA, but it can also be achieved by, working with somebody for a long period of time, and then looking at the framework that we've just discussed and looking at the person's behavior and, logically drawing the parallels. Obviously, that's not going to be as effective as doing the assessment yourself or having that person do the assessment. But still, you can learn a lot from just observing somebody's behavior in terms of their preferences. And then the final thing, and this is where the development bit comes in, is to actually learn strategies to change your behavior to get the best out of the other person, and for the other person to change their behavior to get the best out of the relationship with you. In the same way that a marriage or any father-son relationship or a relationship between brothers is dependent on both parties being willing to adapt and adjust their behavior, it's exactly the same in the workplace. So we very often do team sessions where we would have a team of people, between 15 and 20 people in a room, and we would talk about the different behavioral styles in the room. And, we would have a conversation. How do I adapt my behavior when I'm working with George? How do I adapt my behavior when I'm working with Mark or with Ian? And likewise, how do they need to adapt their behavior so that we can get the best out of the team in the end? So absolutely, Johan, it's a tool that we very often use as part of a development process, whether it's for an individual or for a team. And just as I mentioned earlier on, if we're talking about personal development, then I would definitely recommend getting something like an emotional intelligence assessment involved as well. Because, obviously it's about that self-knowledge of managing your own emotions and understanding the emotions of other people as well, which lies more on the personality side. But definitely a developmental conversation as well.
Andries, I see there's another question regarding the cost of assessment at your company.
Okay, so that's unfortunately not a very simple question to answer, because it depends very much on whether we're talking about a once-off or whether we're talking about a organization wanting to use our tools on a continuous basis. But I'll give you the variance. If we do a once-off with a feedback, it would be around the 1,500 mark. If we do it on a continuous basis for an organization, that can go down to about 700 Rand per assessment for individuals.
All right, thank you very much. Camilla, I'm not very sure what you. All right. Yeah. Where's our questions? Come on, guys.
Danie, I'm not sure if you can see. There's a question from Mark Button. I'm not sure if you can see that question, as well as Johan.
Sorry, we already answered that one, and Johan's as well.
And Johan, okay. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions, guys?
There's a question from my side, George Dallas here. Given that ultimately humans, we are social animals, and working in a virtual type of environment, surely it's got a limited shelf life, this new way of working, and at some point it's going to revert to normal as we know it, because this new normal is not really normal. It's partially normal and it's fast running out. Your response, Andries?
It's a very interesting observation, George. And what we have found is that different people and different companies have embraced, as you referred to, the new normal to various degrees. We ran quite a bit of research over the last few months, specifically about whether people prefer to return to work after the pandemic, or whether they want to continue to work from home, or third option, do you want a blended approach? And the third option is the one that wins by a country mile. The vast majority of people are saying, we have now learned that we can do a lot of the stuff remotely. I don't need to be in an office every day. However, as you rightly said, people still want that collaboration. People still want that social interaction with their colleagues. So the number one response we're getting is that people would prefer a blended approach. Before the pandemic, working from home in most industries, I know that there were exceptions, but working from home in most industries was almost frowned upon. You know, why do you want to work from home? There must be a very good reason. I have a colleague that during the pandemic, she used to work in my team in South Africa, and she was in the Pretoria office on a daily basis before the pandemic. The pandemic came. 6 months into the pandemic, she applied for a job in our UK office, but she still lives in South Africa. And then she decided, well, I'm going to move down to George. I don't need to live in Pretoria if I don't have an office to go into. And now she lives in George, and she works remotely for our head office in the UK. Now, that is a bit of an extreme example, but the clear winner when you ask that question to people is, do you want to work in an office or do you want to work at home? Is some kind of a blended approach where I work from home some days and I come into the office for specific meetings. And that could mean that we group our meetings together. You know, I come into the office on a Tuesday and a Thursday, and I try and organize all my meetings around those 2 days, and I coordinate with my colleagues that need to be in the same meetings rather than go into the office every day. Just something that I saw that was quite amusing. I think many of you may have seen it on LinkedIn as well. Early in the pandemic, there was this question, who drove digitization of your organization? And the options were, was it the CEO? Was it the CFO? Was it the CTO? Or was it COVID? And we believe that COVID has actually done more for digitization than any CTO ever could, because it forced us into this new way of normal.
Yeah, that's actually a new way of looking at it. There must be something positive from it.
No, absolutely.
But as we were talking earlier, we at SIMM would really like to, again, go to the hybrid way of doing the things, because especially with the students and so on, we are losing touch.
Yeah.
And it's just really, you know, Kia will tell you that this email for this presentation went out. It was opened by over 2,000 people. And I think we ended up today, we had attendance RSVPs for nearly 90. And the guys that's on the Zoom today is about 37. So it just tells you that the people really want, they are Zoom fatigue.
Yeah.
They really would nearly give an arm and a leg to get a proper, as we did it in the past, presentation with a cocktail afterwards, with a you know, Q&A around a few snacks and so on, where they can rub shoulders with the grey beers and those kind of things. And there was also a lot of work done during the sessions, and it totally get lost. So in the SIMM world, we really need to concentrate now. Yes, we achieved now the Zoom thing, but now we need to achieve start achieving the hybrid way of doing it. And yes, if there's no other questions, Yes, Andries, thank you very, very much for your time and for sharing your knowledge to us today. And I'm really sure that's not the last time we're going to see you. I think we will misuse you somewhere along the line again. But
thank you very much, Danie. I really, really appreciate it as well. And thanks for everybody's collaboration and making it so interactive and reacting. I really enjoyed it. And as I said, you're welcome to send us an email to the email address on your screen. I'd be happy to do a complimentary assessment for those that were on the call. And hopefully we can chat again at some point.
So, Andries, I hope you don't do everything digitally these days, because we expect you to sign some big contracts and some big checks. So we will give you send you a parcel in the post looking like this, and I hope you will use it to your advantage. And to
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
And South Africa's advantage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, guys, and drive carefully, I hope, and remember to have a cocktail.
Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic evening.
Thanks, Kia, George.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye.